The Future of Money, Governance, and the Law is hosted by the Government Blockchain Association, a worldwide community to connect, communicate, and collaborate. This show is produced by Podtex. To learn more and how to host your own show, go to www.podtex.com. Podtechs. Podtex, your partners in podcasting.
Hi, this is Gerard Daché. I'm the Executive Director of the Government Blockchain Association, and today I have with me Joe Walton. Thrilled to have you on board with us, Joe. Joe's going to be speaking at our upcoming event, The Future of Money, Governance, and the Law, and we wanted to take this time to let Joe tell you a little bit about himself and what he's up to. So, Joe, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, Gerard. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to do this and happy to be a part of the GBA event, The Future of Money, Governance, and the Law, coming up later this month in a couple weeks. You sent me the questions, or at least some of the startup questions to talk about. And so what is my background and how did I get involved in this? And so I'll say I got involved in technology in the 90s and kind of drifted towards consulting and information security in the early 2000s, and then ended up going back into higher ed and getting my undergraduate degree and then a master's. I kind of decided I wanted to go to graduate school when I got my undergrad in 2010, and went to graduate school and I'd gotten involved in public policy and politics at the local level in Central Virginia, and decided I wanted to go and seek a graduate degree, a master's in public administration. And so part of that, at the end in 2014, I had started mining Bitcoin in 2013 and have always kind of had a homebrewed technology perspective. I'm a technology hobbyist, and so it started mining Bitcoin and goofing around in that regard. And so part of my one of the latter classes that I took in the Master's of Public Administration program was called policy analysis. And so we had to pick a public policy issue, research it, write about it, and from that perspective. And so I briefly chose or considered net neutrality, which was big at the time in 2013 and 2014, or it kind of comes and goes, but it was big at the time then. And then after maybe a couple hours of kind of playing around with that, figuring out what I was going to do for this, the major paper of that particular class, policy analysis, I thought, well, let me check on this Bitcoin thing. I've been goofing around with it for a year, and at that point, I spent maybe 10 minutes and kind of really dove into currency and currency systems and monetary theory and things like that. And instantly, at that point, I already knew that I wanted to, when I was in another semester, I was going to finish the grad degree, the master's, and I knew I wanted to go into a Ph.D. program in public policy. And everybody had said, find a topic, find something you're passionate about and that you like. And so once I found the cryptocurrency and kind of the history of monetary policy and things like that, I knew that was where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. And so I finished that semester by writing a few times about Bitcoin and currency systems. And that was late. That was the fall semester of 2014. Blockchain was just starting to, that the Bitcoin or blockchain not Bitcoin, Bitcoin not blockchain kind of debate blockchain was just starting to emerge as this basic technology that underpinned Bitcoin and might have a life of its own and might be this sort of agnostic technology that didn't have a lot of the baggage of Federal Reserve policy and central banking and monetary policy. So long story short, I did the work in late 2014 and early 2015 related to the Masters in Public Administration related to Bitcoin. And then at that point, as I started to get into the blockchain into the PhD program in public policy at VCU in Central Virginia, at that point started to work with different aspects of mainly it got into semiotics and how the semiotic perceptions of currency systems and blockchain kind of fit into that from the perspective of the how humans interpret different technological aspects of society. And blockchain, which is the main area that I've kind of written about over the last several years, blockchain has a lot of significant applications to human use and human applications of things that basically the common denominator is trust, of how we trust systems and how we interact with systems and how we think of ourselves as an individual in society. And so, long story short, that's how I got into blockchain was through graduate school studies and work and kind of being a technology hobbyist. And over the years, ended up through social media, probably primarily LinkedIn, but also I was getting involved in different. There's a couple MOOCs, massive online open course curriculum type events that I got involved in, and started to find people through Twitter and find people through LinkedIn and other mailing lists and things like that. And so, probably a couple of years ago, I stumbled on the Government Blockchain Association, and one of the problems that I've found, ironically, is I come at technology from the public policy perspective and from the public sector perspective, and a lot of what's out there in information systems and business systems is a lot of private sector stuff. And so I was instantly intrigued by the Government Blockchain Association because I think blockchain has a lot of applicability to public systems and public sector, probably more so than private sector for a lot of reasons that we can talk about here and that I'll talk about in the upcoming conference. But so that's the long story and the background version of how I got involved in blockchain.
Tell me a little bit about you had an interest in public policy, right? What was it that drove you into public policy? Because you got a pretty interesting history outside of the falling into Bitcoin blockchain space.
So I had been doing technology and technology sales and started to drift towards, like I said, consulting and information security kind of aspects. And really, it was being a trusted consultant and helping clients navigate the waters of other vendors that were coming in and whatnot. And so I ended up being uh, I was strictly private sector, but I was doing things that I felt like were in the best interests, regardless of monetary for myself or for other parties. And so I drifted towards doing the right thing and like a common purpose that everybody should be ascribing to. And part of that ended up being related to some local development near my neighborhood in 2004. And so I was always a political junkie, and then that mindset of sort of doing the right thing and the common good turned into fighting a rezoning that was adjacent to my neighborhood, and politics coupled with public policy and things like that ended up having me pursuing that from a graduate school perspective.
Got it. And then your interest in Bitcoin was really primarily financial, right? And then when you found out about the blockchain applications in the GBA, that's when you kind of turned back towards the public policy aspect. Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty close. I mean, I was mainly amused with Bitcoin from the technical perspective. I downloaded the full blockchain for Bitcoin. I did mining. I had actually in the mid to late '90s got involved in distributed computing, and there were some different systems and programs and competitions related to cracking cryptography related to some of the early lesser versions of cryptography. And so the distributed nature of Bitcoin and the blockchain and that kind of decentralized database and involving cryptography and the public key infrastructure and things like that. That was what amused me or intrigued me was just that this is a fascinating application of technology. When I stumbled into sort of the questions about about currency systems and what money is and where money comes from kind of thing, that's when I was even more intrigued because it appealed to sort of my entrepreneurial side and business side and that kind of thing. So it was never about making money and hitting the lottery and gambling kind of thing. It was more like this is a really deep intellectual pursuit at a forefront of society and civilization.
So what's really going to resonate when we start up again is your thoughts on the monetary policy aspect, your thoughts on the technology, right? So we want to go a little shorter on sort of the blow by blow. We definitely want to cover it at a high level, but I want to get into what are your thoughts in terms of the impact that the technology has on monetary policy, on politics, and that's what's going to really capture their attention.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to start over again.
Yeah.
Just going to take a note. So 11:08. All right. Hi, my name is Gerard Daché. I'm the executive director of the Government Blockchain Association. I've got Joe Walton with me today on the podcast. Joe is out of the state of Virginia. He's a Ph.D. student down at Ph.D. candidate out of VCU and has worked in Virginia State. And Joe, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be on this podcast and be a part of the conference coming up in a couple of weeks.
Excellent. All right. So listen, real quick, tell us a little bit about your background, right? So, early on, you mentioned you were a little into technology, and walk us through your story from going into technology into first kind of finding out about Bitcoin and blockchain and the technology.
So I got involved in technology in the 90s and had kind of come through the .com stuff and been involved in some technology sales. I'd always been a political junkie and ended up getting involved in some local politics and doing some stuff related to public policy in that regard. I actually ran for office and served in a local government capacity on the Board of Supervisors in Central Virginia. But always as a technology junkie, I'd heard about Bitcoin and kind of got involved in that and started to see the potential and how that intersected with some sort of deep social issues related to currency systems and where they come from. And so then at that point in the early 2000s, I'd gotten into a graduate program and a master's program and started writing about Bitcoin at first and then ultimately blockchain and how they intersect at the social level and where that intersects with currency systems and central banking and the gold standard and what money means to society and to individuals.
Awesome. So let's hit the technology part first, right? So you were a technologist, right? When you first encountered Bitcoin and blockchain and this technology, what were some of your epiphanies from a technology perspective?
I did distributed computing, or I'd gotten involved in distributed computing. I did SETI at home, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, back in the 90s and the late 90s. There were also some competitions where you would load these little small command line type programs that would run hashes to attempt to crack different cryptographic standards. And so I'd heard about it in 2012 and 13, cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. And so I, fired it up. I had a bunch of computers and fired it up on a few and downloaded the blockchain, and then ultimately was participating in some of the guilds. BTC Guild was the one that I mined for. And so really was just kind of amused about it and thought it was interesting. And, the news coverage was kind of picking it up. But it wasn't until I had to write a public policy paper for my master's program that I delved into it to see how much and what the public policy implications were, and really found that it was might be a narrow pool, but it was a very deep pool. And some of the Frederick Hayek's kind of treatises on denationalized currency and where John Kenneth Galbraith's money, whence it came and where it went. I found those texts early on and thought this is a deep sociological issue that now the forefront of technology, which I had always tried to be on the bleeding edge of technology, but the forefront of technology was tackling one of the final frontiers of society and civilization, and that is, what is money and can you create cryptography to represent sort of digital gold?
So what do you think the big impact is, right? So, walk us through kind of from your perspective what the impact of this technology has on the economy and public policy.
Well, I think it's twofold. The initial foray or the initial forefront was Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and the ability for what was initially different variants and side chains and forks, and then what has turned into tokens and that whole realm of anything that you can create value or create a finite amount of that the value could potentially be affixed. So what that has done at a minimum, what that has done is made us seriously question what is money, where it comes from, what it is, who controls it. The final answers to those and how that will all shake out is obviously remains to be seen. But when I've been talking to people about it for 5 or 6 years, and the answer I say, or one of the points that I make is, if I owed a friend $50 and I offered to give them a 1932 Ty Cobb mint condition baseball card in exchange for that $50 debt, they'd probably take it because they believe that that is worth more than the $50 that I may own them or owe them. And so from that point, you can have all kinds of socioeconomic values and exchanges. And so Bitcoin has made us question that and then search around for what the answer is and what a given monetary system can be, currency system or monetary system can be, and what it can do. That's part of your question. The other question is blockchain.
But before we go on for a second, so it sounds like what you're really talking about is sort of the tokenization of value, right? Can you give us some? Is that right? And if so, can you give us some examples of how value could be tokenized?
So I can. In my Ph.D. research, I'm as you mentioned, a Ph.D. candidate, and am working on finalizing my research to defend my final proposal. But what I have created, or what I have come to establish for my research, and then I'll ultimately continue to use for research, is that socioeconomic value actually is a spectrum and not a single value, or it is not working towards a common and single standard. And so a lot of people talk about the post-World War II Bretton Woods Accords and how the dollar kind of became one of the basic, or the common universal equivalent that all exchanges would be pegged to somehow. And so that worked well, but what we're seeing now is different nationalities and different geopolitics that make the dollar not as favorable as a universal standard. And so that's forcing us to say, what is socioeconomic value, and how, is there going to be one standard, or will there be multiple standards? And the continued prevalence and narrative that the gold standard, and that gold is still being stockpiled in different countries around the world, um, makes us have to say there's more than one value. There's more than one thing that people at a local level value. They value a local community, but then they also participate in the geopolitical and geoeconomic economy, and so they need to be able to participate in both realms and in both ways. And so that suggests that more than one currency can and should exist. And so I think that answers your question, but
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah. Let's stay on this because there's so much to cover here before we get into blockchain. But that has some significant repercussions, right, for people in government. So assuming something like, so let's talk about the impact that potentially has from a government standpoint, and then beyond that, let's talk about it from maybe a banking and financial institution perspective.
Well, so from a basic perspective, I mean, there have been several marquee congressional hearings on Bitcoin over the last few years, and I am constantly amused at how confounding the notion that something other than the U.S. dollar could become an international standard. How confounding that notion is for for people in Congress, whether it's Senate banking or the House Commerce and subcommittees. A lot of those folks, there are several folks in Congress and some folks in the state of Virginia and around the country, notably maybe Wyoming, that get it, that they instantly see that, hey, this is actually a thing, that you can have different standards, and that the U.S. dollar won't be the the predominant and hegemonic currency system around the world forever. But there are so many people for whom they either don't like that an alternate reality, or they literally can't get their head around the notion that the dollar is not always going to be supreme. And I compare it to the sun never set 300 years ago or 400 years ago. The sun never set on the British Empire, and now they're post-colonial and regarded as still a cultural and important geopolitical force, but they're an island in the North Atlantic. And so I think that at some point in the next several decades, the U.S. will become something similar to that, where we're still looked to for leadership and for guidance, but there's a lot of other people around the world who either have their own socio-economic value systems. There's a billion people in China and a billion people in India, and they have their own systems, or they specifically don't want to use the U.S. dollar because they don't like that the geopolitical consequences of having done so. And so um, the U.S. needs to be prepared. That's what I wrote in my first kind of assembled thoughts in 2014, is the United States needs to be prepared for a post-dollar, dominant geopolitical and globalized economy. And somehow or another, that's going to involve non-national currency systems like Bitcoin.
So I hear people say all the time, well, the government will never allow that to happen. How do you respond to that?
So coming from somebody who has a lot of training in government and a lot of bias and interest in the public good, the government can't stop that from happening any more than the United States could take technology out of it, take Bitcoin out of it, any more than the United States could force the U.S. dollar to always be the predominant currency system. Like as we see, geopolitically in the last couple of years, China wields I shouldn't say that, a significant amount of power with their yuan, and then India is still burgeoning. But between the two of them, there's a couple billion people right there that if they do flex their economic muscle and decide to partner up or what have you, they would be a formidable adversary, economic adversary to the United States. And so you just can't. There's no way to force in a post-colonial world. And we don't want geopolitical conflict, or at least not significant actual warfare. And without those two pieces, colonialization and warfare, there's no way to force currency systems on other nations. And so you have to go with, ironically, what the people want and what sort of the global economy wants to shift to or undertake.
So a lot of people would say that the U.S. has a great deal of economic power and might, and that they have the ability to impose wills on other countries when it comes to sanctions regimes. Because the system is so locked in, right? Because foreign banks maintain U.S. dollars as reserve. Things are priced and indexed for cross-border payments in terms of dollars, and that web, right, kind of locks it in. If what you're saying is true, right, then how do you see that potentially unfolding? Because that's not like a hop, skip, and a jump. It seems like it's a pretty significant shift.
So true. I mean, my initial thought to people say, well, this is how it is, and there's a lot of reasons why it wouldn't, you can't change. And I would say every historical regime thought that, and we are now here, where a country that's a couple hundred years old is the predominant one. But as I think I might have mentioned to you, I was on my honeymoon a couple weeks ago, and we went to Rome, and to look back at that from a couple thousand years ago, and see and understand, as I do from a historical perspective, the power that Rome wielded and the other countries wielded prior to that, and other cultures and societies concurrent to Rome and prior to Rome and since Rome. History is our guide over the last couple of years, that, or a couple thousand years, that regimes don't last, and predominant currency systems and monetary policy and cultures don't last for thousands of years, certainly not as a geopolitical dominance. And so it can easily shift. And ironically, without going too far into U.S. national politics, but ironically, those kinds of shifts can occur from unintended consequences of um, protectionist trade and ill-gotten trade wars. I think that the history books are full of countries that have decided they do have enough economic power to try and wag the dog, which is to say the rest of the world. And so they start to try and do that. And the rest of the world just simply shrugs their shoulders and says, okay, well, we'll kind of form a coalition without you. And so quickly, those countries, after having waged a trade war and protectionist trade policies, try and reestablish their currency and their economic policies as the predominant around the world. And they find that they're too late, and that the party has kind of shifted to um, uh, some new coalitions. And so how can it happen? It can happen easily. I mean, the globalization is, it has, if anything, has taught us that um, the any given power is only able to continue to be that power based on a lot of fine and delicate agreements and not rocking the boat. But if one party wants to rock the boat, the rest of the world will kind of continue on in their own way without that party. And so Russia is not, again, not to get too political, but Russia has found that over the last couple decades, that while they may have the Soviet Union may have dissolved, Russia can't get much power, or can't get build much of a coalition, and so it's kind of going its own way. And the United States, I fear, is headed down that path too.
So let's talk about that from an international perspective, because I think that's an excellent point. U.S. GDP, debt to GDP ratio is what, about 100 and, I don't know, 5-10%. I think Japan maybe around 200%. I think China around 300%. So if the world moves to a cryptocurrency base, it's not just the U.S. that faces significant challenges. It's really the global governments. Do you? So unlike a power before that falls, this is more than a power. This is essentially an entire economic system, right? Do you think that those powers would essentially band together to try to stop this kind of thing from happening?
So yes, I mean, I believe my hair is not on fire. I'll say, I mean, a lot of people who are involved in crypto and blockchain see some folks whose hair is on fire, and various different persuasions and whatnot. And so I tend to try and be a little bit more pragmatic about what is happening based on an understanding of public policy and kind of history. And so, yeah, first and foremost, I think that the consumer and that the citizen and consumer still wield and should still wield the ultimate power. And even in some place like China, it's kind of, they run a pretty tight police state over there, or kind of a Chinese capitalist state or communist capitalist state over there. But nonetheless, they are having some problems with Hong Kong and those kinds of things, and so they're not foolish enough to think that they can continue to keep a sleeping population. And so while their GDP to debt ratio may be high, and Japan's may be high, and the United States may be high, that doesn't GDP, which I've actually written about and done a good bit of research on, was a woefully inadequate metric. It's a perfect metric for geopolitics and for global economy or national economies and global economic activity, but it is terribly imperfect for measuring citizen satisfaction and the kind of the public participation and the communities and democracy and things like that that are actually undergirding national and geopolitical economic activity. And so those numbers may be true, or certainly are true, and they seem daunting. But when the population kind of shifts to a new thing or does a new thing, when our governments are based on a centralized currency, uh, sudden, that can significantly call into question the viability of how those currency systems and how those economies are structured, just simply because people choose something
So,
different, not unlike how they choose a different, large fast food chain from one decade to the next.
so let's talk about the impact on those countries individually. In the United States, for example, people make the statement that we export our debt,
Mhm.
right? Because when we increase the money supply, we devalue the currency. All of these banks around the world that are maintaining dollars, right, as their reserve, whenever we devalue our currency because we're increasing the supply, it actually has a negative impact on all of these banks around the world, right? Their assets essentially, and and which gives us the capacity to spend
Mhm.
more than we bring in, right? Without a meaningful negative impact. If that's gone, right? What's the impact on the U.S. government, and more importantly, or not more important, but equally as important, what's the impact on our citizens if the U.S. government can no longer do the things that it does, right?
Well, that was two questions right there at the end, and what's the impact on our citizens, and what's the impact on the U.S. government being able to do what it does? And certainly we could. There's pros and cons to what, in my opinion, pros and cons to what the U.S. government does domestically and around the world. So the impact to our citizens in the United States is we uh, get an important lesson in the fact that we are members of the global economy. And while our dominance is based mostly largely on the fact that we are an outsized consumer of economic goods. And so I've never seen this, maybe somebody has done this analysis, but if you normalize our economic power uh, for our consumption and our consumer economy, it's an anomaly, and we would actually have the same amount of power as all the other countries. We just consume so much, and so that has bound all these countries, particularly China, but Mexico and sort of the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, has bound them to us, and that's been good for geopolitical stability and to prevent warfare and things like that. And so I'm not arguing that was bad, but it won't and can't necessarily continue that we will always be the greatest consumer of goods from around the world and keep strict or keep these countries in line, if you will, or heading in the right democratic direction, just simply because they want to continue to be trade partners with us. And so the American consumer will say, "Hey, this is something has changed here." If China consumed at the rate that the United States consumed, or India consumed at the rate the United States consumed, that would dwarf our economic power because they literally have 7 times the amount of people. And so as the economic standards come up there and the standards of living come up in India and China, uh, that's bound to happen just because they have more people. And so the United States needs to prepare, and people need to understand that won't be the global leader. Will still continue to be an important component of geopolitics, just like the United Kingdom is. But we won't be the global leader. And so what effect that will have and how that transition will occur, which I think was the latter part of your question, is it needs to be done carefully, and we need to not make enemies of economic trading partners and of strategic partners, because they will either leave us behind as fast as they can because they can work with the rest of the world, or they will actually get into a punitive kind of state because we're continuing to try and wield outsized power to the rest of the world. And so it's a fine line to be a leader. You have to try and do the right thing, but you also can't do so by holding others back. You got to let everybody else come and be a part of the global economy, which they should. We want China's living standards to come up and India's living standards to come up, and certainly smaller countries around the world. And when they do, that will put them on par and equal with us. And that's going to mean, this comes back to cryptocurrency, that's going to mean that we should prepare for a non-US dollar hegemony, and we should want something that's denationalized, and that isn't any particular country's preferred currency, because we want a level playing field, and we want something that everybody can participate equally with. And so Bitcoin is an interesting case study, cryptocurrency in general, because they are a replacement for gold, and gold has, for thousands of years, has been that least common denominator of currency that has allowed these smooth transitions of power to occur.
You mentioned, you talked about so many things. I just want to go down 13 different rabbit holes at the same time. Let's talk about China. So I've been in China probably about 20 times in the last 3 years. And one thing that is amazing to me is, if you look at them, they, in one generation, right, they've gone from rickshaws to Rolls Royces. And they did it by essentially, when they privatized their land, they basically allowed people to lease land, and they had a huge amount of foreign investment, and they put tons of that money into construction, right? So they built cities everywhere, and so there were lots of people who have jobs, and their whole economic activity just exploded. But the underlying principles of their economy, it was sort of like a false start. So now they've got this giant bloated economy without the foundation there. And there have been reports that they've manipulated some of their reporting, and that they're not going to be able to maintain. I believe that the United States, with our economic system, and really it's all about freedom, and I'm a hardcore capitalist, right? I believe that we can compete on a level playing field. But I also think that this transition is going to be challenging, because our whole economic system and way of life revolves around this thing called the Fed and institutions. And what kind of roadmap do you see in terms of, if you were advising the government, people in government, and this is something that I hope that we talk about in our symposium here in a couple of weeks, what advice would you give to governments to help shepherd this transition, right? Because I believe it's going to happen, right, whether we want it to or not. But I think advising the government about how do you prepare, because I could see it collapse, right, if it's not managed well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Particularly the last phrase of the collapse, and how to, I guess I would rephrase that, or I would say, how do you avoid calamity? I think I would say involuntary and unintentional calamity of something just blowing up and breaking. I don't see that happening. I think generally government and the private sector work hand in hand in the United States and around the world. I mean, we saw that with the 2008, the Great Recession, that was a calamity, for right, wrong, or indifferent, and for whatever the underlying reasons were. And everybody banded together and said, "Wow, we're really in this together. We gotta kind of figure this out." Um, and so I think that we have the ability um, to get over those blips and just pick our trust and our faith up in the overall geopolitical, to pick it up and move it on the other side of the cliff or the chasm, and then and carry on. But my advice that I would give, and actually I've reused it a couple times, restated it, but reused it from the way that I wrote in 2014, and that is the United States regulators and legislators need to think and be aware and start saying, along the lines of what you just said and what I've said, is think just maybe there might be a different ending to this story than that the United States is the white stallion that continues to prevail and forever, into eternity and infinity. Somehow or another, all regimes, they don't fade away to zero, although over time they will. But somehow or another, if what we have been doing with the power of the dollar in post World War II, if what we have been doing was right and was the right thing to do and was effective, we will bring all these other countries up and along to a point where there are forces to be reckoned with. And so we have to be aware of that and understand that, and treat them nicely, because these countries are the ones that will be carrying the global economy and globalization and geopolitics forward. And so we can't hold them down, nor can we try and abuse them, because they will be carrying the torch with us for how civilization unfolds. And so I don't think there'll be a catastrophe. I think it will somehow, things will continue to stay together in the sense that that they should, that we've come to understand from our economic standards. But I do think that the worst, that it could go poorly and be an about face for the United States if we don't embrace this change and don't embrace the idea that all these other countries and these just literally masses and millions and billions of people aren't part of and treated as equals and part of the global economy. There was one good book that I read several years ago. It was um, there was a couple different versions of it, but Germs, Warfare, Guns, and Steel. I'm getting the title wrong, but there very much is the possibility of major natural catastrophes. That's probably the thing that there's greater concern about, to really alter the way of life of massive volcanoes or an asteroid or large storms and global warming and things like that. That has the ability to destabilize the global economy, and that would be an equal opportunity offender that would be difficult for everybody to achieve. But the regulators need to. I think the regulators are on board. U.S. regulators are on board. Some of the international regulators, I think, are moving a little more slowly. But mainly the U.S. legislator, they need to move forward, and elections have a way of renewing things in the United States and around in free countries around the world. And so I think that will be kind of, as it usually is that free and fair elections will continue to renew perceptions and make things work as things unfold with.
I was in Cameroon I don't know, several months ago, and the president had just won re-election for his 58th year, and yeah, and I was speaking to the ICT minister, right, Internet Communications and Technology. She reports directly to the president, and she said, "We're interested in all the blockchain applications except for voting. Our voting system works just fine." Yeah. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'd love to stay on this cryptocurrency economic impact because I think the one thing where I maybe disagree with you a little bit is I think the thing that we have to get under control is, and I think this is a problem with all democracies. And again, I'm a huge fan of democracy, but the systemic challenge that it has is we spend more than we bring in because we're incentivized to essentially give more to our constituents and not to tax them, right? And regardless of whether you have an R or a D after your name, if you raise taxes or if you cut spending, you're likely not to get reelected. So we tend to tax less and spend more, and you can kick the can down the court a little while, right? The 2008 recession, I think the solution there was to kick the can down the court, or at other times to raise a debt ceiling or other things. I don't think that's really a cataclysmic change, but at a certain point, you're out so far over your skis that you just can't maintain the balance, right? And I think that if I would make any recommendations to governments, is figure out how to live within your means, because in the kind of a currency world that you're talking about, you may not have the ability to constantly.
And I don't disagree with that. And that makes me think of one of the questions that you asked a few minutes ago of the GDP debt to GDP of Japan and China and the United States. Yes, without a doubt. And so I ran as a Libertarian nominee for the 7th Congressional District of Virginia in last year's election. And without a doubt, that has to be resolved. That strictly taxing and spending equation has to be resolved. That'll be resolved individually within the countries, or needs to be resolved individually within the countries. And the fear, I think, that a lot of folks have about crypto and Bitcoin and denationalized currency systems is they look back, maybe only superficially, but look back at how the disparity between the amount that is collected in taxes and the amount that is spent, where those disparities had major inflections, and the biggest one was in the early 1970s, when we came off the gold standard in the United States and around the world. And so when you when you reduce that elasticity that was created, and certainly notions of eliminating it, that, to your point, which kind of some of your questions were about the culture shock or the economic shock that would be from overnight eliminating that elasticity, that is a grave concern. And can that be done? Would that be done overnight? Obviously, clearly, it can't be done, abruptly. But the notion that we're heading in that direction, to where the United States doesn't have the ability to expand its currency base indefinitely and create more and more debt and more and more deficit spending. Yeah, that definitely has to get rectified, and somehow has to get brought to balance, because that can't sustain itself. And that's what a lot of go ahead.
And we were prosperous, up until we came off the gold standard. It's not as if we needed this elasticity to prosper. We prospered under the fuel and economic engine of capitalism, right? And so we could go back to essentially, theoretically, philosophically, being on the gold standards, right? Being constrained by our actual income. Exactly. So it's possible. I just in this political climate, I just don't see the path from point A to B.
For anybody listening out there, one of the best reads. It's lighthearted and humorous, but on point and very succinct, is John Kenneth Galbraith's "Money: Whence It Came and Where It Went." It was written in 1975 or 76. He's hilarious. He's full of wit, and he is as astute a currency commentator, monetary and currency commentator, as any of the other great worldly philosophers. But he nails it, and that is exactly what happened. There was a whole Vietnam played into that, geopolitics, Nixon's shortcomings or political shortcomings, and China and all those kinds of things played into this notion of it wasn't a laboratory example or experiment of we think this will be better for the economy. There was a lot of reasons of this will be better to solve a couple other, several other geopolitical things. And when you think about it in that light, it does uh, give somebody pause to say, man, we got to this position or started on this track for all the wrong reasons, and now look at what we have. What's going to happen with this? And so civilizations and nations in the past for all of civilization were able to colonize their way out of it or create war, like literal serious war, like overtaking territories and that kind of thing. And we can't do that. The United States certainly can't do it, and no other country can do that. And so the way this was solved in the past is not available to the United States or to anybody. And so what is that reckoning and how does that occur? I don't know, but that's what a lot of the real kind of Bitcoin maximalists think is the way that it should be and think is imminent. And so, that's why I've been fascinated with it and continue to watch it as a pilgrim on the global, as a global economic journey.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've I probably need to wrap it up. There's a couple of things I want to get to real quick before we get off. So the first one is, how'd you find out about GBA? What was your what was your first
I think it was a couple years ago, and I think it was through LinkedIn, or I had gotten involved in some of the online massive open online curriculums, and so I don't remember exactly how, but I think it was through LinkedIn, and that appealed to. I have tried to synergize my interest in public policy and the common good and doing the right thing with my kind of deep technology background. Crypto and blockchain fit that, and the Government Blockchain Association, I think, is exactly the title and the name and the mission of what it is that I'm trying to do is use blockchain and distributed database technology for the common good. And so it isn't. I actually don't think blockchain has as much value inside of any given company because they have their own databases and they don't need a distributed secure database system. But blockchain really comes into its own when you're talking about the deepest levels of trust and trust boundaries between governments within the United States at the state, local, and federal level, but then also the United States or large municipal systems interacting with other countries where there are these significant trust boundaries. And so I think it's a great combination, and the conference coming up of the future of money governance and the law, I think is timely, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's gonna be a great event. When this podcast comes out, I don't know if it'll come out before or after the event. We were hoping it would come out before, but Jiminy Crickets will have we're expecting about 300 people there from local, state, national, international. We've got everybody, IBM, Consensus, Deloitte's going to be there, plus a whole bunch of sort of smaller, innovative companies. We got folks from county governments, the governor of New York sending somebody from their staff down, House, Senate, Department of State. It's just we got people coming from Korea, from India, from Europe. It's going to be an incredible event. So I'm really pretty jazzed about it. I'll tell you something crazy. From the time we got the green light on the venue, right, to showtime, we had about somewhere between 10 and 12 weeks, depending on how you count it. So 12 weeks out, we had hey, we think we got a green light. 10 weeks out, we had a green light. So we put the whole event together.
That's impressive.
Somewhere between 10 and 12 weeks. But what it shows you is that, yeah, it was exhausting. But it shows you the network that already existed, because literally, and that's really the power of what I think GBA is. It's just incredible leaders all over the world that connect together. it's a community of like-minded people. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm really humbled to be a
Yeah.
part of this. And I'm really
I'm happy to be a part, and look forward to
come and share
participating.
your thoughts with us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one more thing. So what's in your future? What are you doing now? What's in your future? And is there any opportunity for people to connect with you?
Currently,
to
my
participate in
plan
whatever
is
you're
to
doing?
finish my dissertation, and that'll be in public policy. And the dissertation title is "Why We Trust Money: Examining Trust and Control in the Adoption of Bitcoin." So my plan is, or my goal is to finish the dissertation by this December and graduate this December. I'm an information security officer at a Commonwealth of Virginia state agency, and so I'll continue to pursue the research. There's a particular aspect of my perception of socio-economic value and trust and control that I'll end up moving forward with in either some published articles or try and work it up into an actual monograph book. And somehow continue to stay in the public sector with information security, and maybe getting to teaching at the higher ed level. But also that's why I'm interested in this conference and some of the other things that are coming up in the next year or so, to take what I've learned and what I'm doing and kind of the state of the industry, and try and do good things and work with other like-minded people. I do. Yeah, he lives about 20 miles away
Mark
in
Wasser?
the east side of Richmond. I participated in a panel with him 6 or 8 months ago, and had lunch with him probably 4 or 5 months ago. And he's great. He has a artificial intelligence and kind of a deep computer science perspective on things, and so he's fascinating to talk to and to listen to in conferences.
So I just asked him recently
Excellent.
to accept a position as CTO for GBA, and and he accepted. He's also leading our GBA token
No, not at all.
project.
I've not
Do
heard of that.
you know anything about the GBA token? All right. Well, so I'll just give you the 30-second overview. So the idea behind the GBA token is that we will reward GBA members that post content, that host meetings, that create value to the GBA organization. And then later, when people want to pay for their memberships, training, conferences, or any other product or service from the GBA, they can pay for it with their token, right? Or if I'm IBM and or I'm some company and I want to get a corporate, a large corporate institutional membership, which is in the thousands of dollars, I can pay either in fiat currency, or I can go to a guy like you and say, hey, can I buy some of your GBA token to pay for my membership? So the idea is that the people in the future that want to get value from GBA can actually transfer currency, transfer value to the people who actually created the value for GBA. And in essence, we're trying to see if we can actually model a decentralized autonomous
DAOs. I could go on about those, but so the other thing is complementary currency systems is part of my matrix that I'm using for my theory of trust and control as a matrix of socioeconomic value. A large part of that is complementary currency systems like loyalty points and airline points and local exchange systems and hour systems. And so that what you're talking about, and so that's in cryptocurrency parlance, that's tokens. But yeah, what you're talking about is a great complementary currency system. I'd be happy to participate and provide content. But that's great, and that's one of the use cases for crypto and the use cases for tokens that I think has a lot of viability in the future.
So what I would love for you to do is go to the gbaglobal.org page. Under GBA Association, go down to working groups, and then join the mining and cryptocurrency working group. Right, and then that, yep, and we've got the white paper out there that we actually have out for review. We've suspended the meetings until after the Future of Money Governance and Law, just because we're all hands on deck preparing for that. But right after the event, we'll be starting those meetings back up, and we need to get the white paper approved, and we've already got the development team
Mining and
staged,
crypto working group.
ready to go ahead and work on development.
Okay, yeah, I'll go check it out.
Mining and cryptocurrency
but soon.
Yeah. And then the other reason why I asked if you knew him is we're looking to revitalize our Richmond chapter. So I'd love, if you and Mark would be willing to, because we have chapters in about 100 cities around the world. But our Richmond chapter was started by a guy who
that'd be great.
Just got busy with other
Mark
things,
is
so we're looking
on
for a leader in the Richmond
information security ISC2, the certifying arm that does the CISSP and some other certs. The local Richmond chapter of that is putting on a blockchain conference, and Mark is involved in that. I just saw his name in the last couple of days. I submitted my yeah
he's on the committee. We're looking to promote that as well. One of the cool things about GBA is we're a very inclusive group, so we don't just promote our events.
That's great. Yeah. And I submitted an application
really
for a speaker slot or a panel slot on that in the last couple of days too. So
I told Mark to. He said, who can we get for speakers? I said, well, go to GBA, and we got a. If anybody listening to this podcast is ever looking for speakers, right, on the GBA website, they can search for speakers. We got thousands of members all over the world, and they're all listed in a directory that's open to the public. So are companies. So if anybody's looking for any resources, speakers or companies, go to the GBA website. They'll find tons of them. But well, Joe, it has been awesome. Gosh, I can't wait. I can't wait to see you in person, and I'm hoping we can grab a beer or a coffee.
Yeah, see you September 14th, and look forward to meeting you too.
Share some more thoughts on all this stuff.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. You have a great day, Joe. Bye-bye. The Future of Money Governance and the Law is brought to you by the Government Blockchain Association, or GBA. The podcast brings together leaders in the public and private sector to discuss how government and industry can work together. We talk about how to enhance the integrity of our institutions and the quality of life for the people they serve.